So today we have Daren Redfearn with us, who's our forage and crop residue specialist here based out of Lincoln. And we're going to have him talk to us a little bit about key considerations for silage and or hay from warm season annuals. So, I know you all saved the really hard warm season questions for Daren. You can unmute and just ask your questions, or feel free to type in the chat. I will monitor the chat and ask Daren any questions that you guys have. With that, I will turn it over to you, Daren.
All right, thank you very much, Mary. And before we start, want to thank everyone for hopping on here this morning. We're getting a little kind of unexpected rain shower here in Lincoln, so I hope the lights stay on for us. Mary informed me that I have more than summer annuals on my title slide. I've got some brassicas and some small grains on there as well. And I told her, I said, that just about covers everything we do from an annual forage standpoint. But today we're going to focus more on that photo that's in the bottom left there on the warm season annuals, and in particular the forage sorghum. The little quick agenda, and it's a pretty long quick agenda. I noted on one of Mary's emails at the end of last week after the webinar on Thursday, she sent around an email, and I interpreted that as a reading assignment of the summer annual forage Neb guide review that Bruce and Jerry put together. That covers a lot of what we might talk about. I'll hit some of the highlights of that today. In particular, just a brief statement or two about dry matter yields, agronomic practices, and also harvest management. One of the big things I think we want to look at today is some of the keys for quality silage and or hay production. I'm speaking again on Thursday, and so we'll hit this one again on Thursday as well. I think one of the important things, especially as we get into these sorghums and the summer annuals in particular, they'll do a lot of things, but each one of them won't do everything. So I think it's important that we look at a little bit at what I call the intended primary use. A lot of that's going to be from my perspective. Then Mary wanted me to go over some of the forage sorghum traits. I think that's the big one there that will be a little bit unique for today. I don't see a lot of info about sorghum traits floating around. I mean, as I'm doing that, it's can be very confusing very quickly. So we'll chat about that toward the end, and then we'll give a little quick summary. But again, this is the Neb guide that we talked about, and in this, the plant descriptions are covered very well. The Sudan grass, the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, the forage sorghum. So I'm not going to get into a lot of that today. I did summarize a table of the agronomic practices, and then Bruce and Jerry do a very nice job of describing some of the strategies for methods of using these summer annuals. When we look at the comparative dry matter yields, and this is taken from that Neb guide, and this is under irrigated conditions. In particular, if we compare what's going on out at North Platte under irrigation to normal rainfall over in the eastern part of the state, our yields are going to be quite similar. Generally, what we see is that the sorghums, they'll generally have a greater forage yield than the other summer annuals. However, there are a lot of similarities and some overlap in forage yield. If you look at the sorghums, Sudan grass, effectively will yield from around on the end of 4 tons an acre up to nearly 5. Forage sorghum, again, yields do overlap with the Sudan grass. The big difference between those two are that forage sorghum, those don't have as much regrowth as the Sudan grass or the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids. So they're typically always better managed as a single harvest. when we look at the other summer annual grasses, pearl millet is a one that's used quite a lot, as is foxtail millet and teff. Again, the pearl millet probably has the greater yield potential of those other warm season grasses. Foxtail millet is and teff to some extent. They're both very short growing season. The big difference between those two is foxtail millet does not regrow after harvest. So again, it's a single harvest forage. And teff with some added fertility and some timely precipitation, you can get a couple of harvests out of that. The big difference between those two, the quality of the teff is going to be much greater. But with all the similarities in the forage yields, some differences in these two, are there specific traits that are important for decision making as we start trying to decide which one of these choices we're going to use? And it's getting to be that time of year is why we felt this was important to include in these webinar series. So the agronomic management practices, here they are listed, a couple of big ones on there: seeding depth. Typically what we see are the forage sorghums and the pearl millet, an inch and a half, adequate seeding depth on that. Foxtail millet is a little shallower, although an inch will get you pretty good stand. It's important to note that teff has an extremely, I started to call it a small seed. It's not a small seed, it's a tiny seed. Has a seeding depth of a quarter an inch or less. And the best way to accomplish that is likely with a brilliant seeder to remove the drop tubes from the drill and just drop that seed on the soil surface and cover it up a little bit. Seeding rates are listed there. Quite a bit of difference in seeding rate, again, depending on the seed size. Forage sorghum, even though it is one of the sorghums, seeding rates of that are about half what we would recommend for Sudan grass and the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids. Pearl millet is going to be similar to forage sorghum. The foxtail millet is going to be similar to the others, and teff, because of that tiny seed, has some pretty low seeding rate. Harvest management practices, again, the grazing and haying and silage. I've got again, these are my perspective here. Sudan grass is, I would call that pretty good for grazing and hay. The sorghum Sudan grass hybrids are probably the most flexible, as I think they can be used across all the types we might use forage, the grazing, the haying, or the silage. Forage sorghum, because of the amount and volume of forage it produces and the moisture content, that doesn't graze very well. It hays even less. So harvesting that as a silage about a mid-dough stage is probably adequate. Again, looking at the grazing for the other summer annuals, pearl millet is the only one of those three that I think should be grazed to any extent. Can you graze the others? Yes, you can. However, their rooting depth is not very great, so there's the opportunity to pull out quite a number of plants. Most often because of those short production windows of foxtail millet and teff. Harvesting hay is probably ideal for those. Would recommend, again, probably at boot to early heading. Foxtail millet does have the awns on there that you need to pay attention to and not let that get away from you. That foxtail millet, that short window of growth from planting to harvest, could be somewhere as early as 45 days up to around 50 to 55. So it is extremely quick in its production window. And while you can make silage, I've seen pearl millet silage. Pearl millet silage will ensile. It doesn't have a high enough sugar concentration to make what I would call quality silage, which affects the palatability some. So that's my overall overview of that. We'll chat with that again right toward the end. Keys for making quality silage and or hay. I had lifted this figure out of a forage textbook. If you notice the date down there, it's about 60 years old. So we've known this for quite a long time. Uh, Biggest key to making quality silage and hay is that number one point right there. Moisture at storage is key. Okay. If you look at the types of silage, there are three types of silage: direct cut, wilted, low moisture. Uh, Oftentimes what we're looking at for these grasses, I think probably would obviously I think be the direct cut for the sorghum silage. But I think as we're looking at some of the others, that wilting is going to be probably more ideal. But basically, what we see in this graph is that if you look at the dry matter loss, regardless of whether you're direct cutting or harvesting dry hay, total losses are pretty similar, about 30%. The main question you've got to answer: are you wanting to risk a storage loss, or are you wanting to risk a harvest loss? That no man's land there between about 35% moisture and 45% moisture. I'll say that's a bad time to try to make a decision, but that's often when we have to try to make a decision. So effectively, that's still too wet for hay, but too dry for silage, if you will. So you're really looking at that low moisture type of silage, which a lot of the baleage is recommended to be put up in that range of low moisture in there. So that's a process and planning to do if you're looking at wilting the forage and maybe trying to put up something that's a little lower moisture. However, if you do note, that does have the lowest dry matter loss, so there are some distinct advantages to doing that. Also want to point out that the harvest and field losses, there are three of them. The actual baling process, the mowing, raking, and baling itself, you can lose up to 20% of the total dry matter in those operations. Mowing is really not going to cause you much loss. Baling has a little bit. That raking, depending on the number of times that you rake and the type of forage you're raking, can result in some losses. That plant respiration is a big one there. That can be up to 16%. Um, that plant respiration is going to occur up until the plant reaches 45% dry matter. Okay, and so that's going to be over in this point here in this low moisture. And so effectively that respiration, the longer that it continues, the more the dry matter that the plant will burn up and yield. Weather is a big one. I think we've all had weather losses if we've even thought about putting up hay. Those can be relatively substantial. But I think if you look at the possibility of harvest and field losses, you add those numbers up. If you have some bad luck and some bad timing, you can pretty well lose a hay crop pretty quickly. Again, we talked about the primary use earlier. Sudan grass, as I indicated, at least again these are Redfearn's perspectives, if you will. Sudan grass, the best primary uses for Sudan grass are going to be as a graze crop or a hay crop. Sorghum Sudan grass, because of the flexibility, it can be used for grazing, hay, and silage. And again, I'll caution that not all of the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids would probably be. They're not all going to have that built-in flexibility. You can find sorghum Sudan grass variety that probably would be best as hay or silage, but not grazing. Conversely, you could probably find one that would be better for grazing and hay, but not necessarily silage. Forage sorghum, as we've indicated, because of the primarily the moisture content in those forage sorghums. Silage is the best use for those. Pearl millet is going to be grazed or hayed, and then the foxtail millet and teff, those are in my mind probably both best used as hay crops. Now these sorghum traits, there are 6 primary traits in the sorghums. Excuse me. Most of these traits can be combined or stacked. And so what that does with the Sudan grass and the forage sorghum, when you make those sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, effectively you got 3 types of forage sorghums. You can have these 6 traits at any extent in any of the 3 of them. And so what that does, that results in an incredible number of forage sorghum hybrids that you can use. But before you use them, you've got to choose from them. Okay. Uh, I thought about doing some math on that to look at the possibilities, but I decided that was not a good use of my time in putting this together, although I may do that someday. But I think you guys that have been in the market for forage sorghums before have looked at all the choices that they have, and it can be awfully confusing. And so when we look at the sorghum traits, these two probably have the most value from a forage quality, a grazing standpoint, if you will. In particular, that brown midrib trait. Basically, that brown midrib trait, that's a genetic mutation. It changes the chemistry of the lignin within the plant. There are a number of genes that can result in this mutation. BMR2, the BMR6, and the BMR12 are the common ones. They can actually stack these BMR traits. So what you might find is a sorghum Sudan grass brown midrib that's a BMR6, BMR12. Okay. Uh, Kind of a joke, but not really. I suppose you could stack these genes enough that you would basically alter the lignin enough that the plant wouldn't even stand up. So the plant does require some lignin so that it can remain rigid. The big thing on the brown midrib, let me back up just a little bit. The obvious what the trait is, you can notice the difference on these brown midrib varieties by looking at the brown midrib does have a brown or tan color. Later in maturity, when you look at the stem, if you cut the stem in a cross section, the stem will also show a brown color. So it's pretty obvious when you're looking at these what you've got. What we see with the brown midrib that's important from a animal nutrition standpoint is we see usually observe lower fiber in these brown midrib types compared to non-brown midrib types. And when I say lower fiber, I'm not talking about 10%. I'm talking about 1 or 2%. The big thing that we see is that altered lignin chemistry that's going to allow a greater digestibility of the fiber. And so overall, with that reduction in fiber and that increase in fiber digestibility, you can get some very nice increases in overall energy availability. The result of that brown midrib trait you see is less lignin, higher digestibility, improved animal performance, and grazing cattle up to 20 to 30%.
Can
I think
there, Darren?
yes.
Yeah, I think one of the things is important to recognize is that, like, looking at the data with grazing animals and the brown midrib, is that if the plants are kept immature, you don't really see that positive response. But if you're like stockpiling or you get the plants mature, that's where you see the real positive response. So in my mind, brown midrib has a lot of benefit if I'm going to stockpile or let the plant get to maturity, or I'm going to do something like haying or silage. If I'm going to graze in season and it's growing and I'm keeping it vegetative, I'm not going to see that beneficial response. And we do see a little bit of yield reductions typically with the brown midrib. So there is a little bit of a trade-off, right?
Yeah. No, it is. That's kind of that excuse me, kind of that point I skipped over there, that you see the greater expression in mature plants. If you take a brown midrib and a non-brown midrib, and you follow that harvesting at 30 to 40 inches with multiple harvests, you don't see a great lot of difference in the quality, but you will see some difference in the yield. I did quite a bit of work with the brown midribs back early in my career, back in this would have been the late 1990s, when they were starting to look at a lot of these brown midribs. And one of the things that we noticed back at that time is after some of those harvests, could be an early harvest, could be a late harvest, the brown midribs really didn't have a lot of regrowth compared to the non-brown midribs. I think some of that has gone away, but I don't think they've completely eliminated that. So the dwarf brachytic trait is the next one, and I do have these in parentheses because you will see some of the varieties, listed as BMR, BD, sorghum Sudan grass, and that can cause a bit of confusion. But that dwarf brachytic trait is another trait, kind of an interesting one. It's again a genetic trait that causes compact or shortened stem internodes. Typically, you have same number of leaves on the plant but less stem, and so the result of this is an increased leaf to stem ratio. At least common sense or common thinking would tell you that that should result in a little bit higher quality forage, in particular if it's harvested as hay or silage. So, as an example, you can have these two combined together, a brown midrib and a dwarf brachytic, which would give you a couple of avenues there for increased forage quality. Some of the other traits, and these two are related. The photoperiod sensitive trait, that trait causes plants from becoming reproductive during long days. Typically, what we see is that heading will not occur until the days become shorter than about 12 hours and 20 minutes. And our neck of the woods here in Nebraska, this is going to be sometime in mid to late September. The result of this is higher yield due to a longer period of vegetative growth. So again, you're probably looking at maybe not grazing this. This would be something that I think might be a little more valuable for a harvested forage, either hay or silage. The delayed maturity is different from the photoperiod sensitivity, but you wind up with a similar effect. This is a trait that causes delayed maturity in plants where heading occurs not based on day length, but rather to an accumulation of heat units. And so this would be akin to comparing 75-day corn to 120-day corn. Okay. A couple of other traits we see that can have some usefulness. One's the male sterile or male sterility. The other one is the dry stalk. Looking at this male sterility, again, that's a trait that causes non-fertile pollen production, and so the plants can't self-pollinate. Okay, so if you isolate these fields of male sterile sorghums, they will produce a seed head, but the seed head won't have any grain on it. Okay, if there is other pollen close by, I think the recommendations, are a quarter mile, half a mile. You can't have a field of male sterile right next to a sorghum that produces pollen. Even Johnson grass or Sudan grass will pollinate it. What this does on these is useful on these taller sorghums. Improves the standability. Also, you see an increase in stem carbohydrates or soluble sugar concentrations because that's not translocated from the stem to the grain to fill the grain. And so, what we might expect, I think Mary talked about some stockpile grazing. This would be a good one for that. Because you might have a greater palatability if you're grazing it because of those increased sugars, would have better fermentation characteristics if it's in silo. So that's one trait. The other one is dry stalk, and that one is kind of the only one of these to me that's really self-explanatory. This is a trait that causes lower water concentration in the stem, results in faster stem drying compared to plants with a similar stem diameter. So this could be extremely useful for a sorghum that you intend to hay. Probably the least common of the bunch. So take-home messages from today. There are just an incredible number of forage sorghum types, almost too many to choose from in one setting. I think to help that decision process a little better is being able to understand what the primary intended use is going to be. If it's going to be primarily grazing, primarily hay or primarily silage, or if you want to build in some flexibility to grazing hay and or silage, study those options, look at the alternatives, and then go ahead and make your best choice.
All right. Thanks, Daren. We'll open it up to questions. What questions do you have? I'd also like to point out some of these traits are now available like in sorghum Sudan and pearl millet. And
Yep.
so we're getting more and more options. And so understanding the possible benefits and where the extra cost in some cases might be worth the investment, I think is useful.
Yeah, the brown midrib is a common one in the pearl millet. The Sudan grasses in particular, I know, Mary, you talked about those last week. Mary uses Piper. Piper's an old one. They do have some hybrid Sudan grasses that you would expect to be a little bit more costly, but you would expect a little better agronomic performance out of them as well.
Jerry, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, no, I was just going to throw out a question for Daren related to fertilizer on these summer annuals. So typically, where do you see, or what levels do you see as most often recommended? And of course, primarily talking about nitrogen.
Yeah, it's a lot like the other recommendations. Typically, you see some recommendations up to 80 pounds of in an acre. I think if you're looking at something that's probably going to be more than 60, I think a split application is going to be best. In addition to the environmental concerns that you've got with applying those heavy rates of nitrogen, it's like fertilizing any grass. They're going to take that up, and the yield is going to become just overwhelming. So I think if you're looking at grazing, I think if you have the capability to do a split application, I think that's might be a little better for the grazing. If you're looking at a hay crop, again, I think the sorghum Sudan grasses or the Sudan grasses that you could get multiple harvests off of, I think there's some advantage there to splitting those applications. The single harvest crops that we have, a single application with a little lower rate.
So when you talk about split application, like what would the timing look like for your warm season? What would be your suggestion?
I mean, as for a hay crop, use a hay crop as an example because that's a little easier to understand, I think. But if you're looking at a multiple cut sorghum Sudan grass hybrid, 40, 50 pounds at planting or shortly after emergence would be the first application. Second one would be almost immediately after the second harvest.
And so harvest, you would be like 45, 60 days?
Yeah, I think 40. Yeah, 45 would probably get that. I think 45 days. That
Okay.
would give you a 45 day, and then another 45 day for 90 days. So that'd be over a 3-month period.